All right, hello Rangers. We are back and we are talking about the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Season 1. So I was really sure that the second episode in the lineup was either High Five or it would be Cleanup Club, but um, it is episode 6 in the YouTube playthrough list, and it is episode 2 um, in the Google episode guide. So I'm said I was sticking with the Google episode guide, and so that's what we're going to stick with here. Um, I do think this ranks lower than Day of the Dumpster on episode lists. There is some very weird pacing in this episode. There are a couple things I really like about it that I'll get to, but I think the things that I kind of notice about it. One is that Pudgy Pig is sort of the perfect monster for Rita to make grow, and she doesn't. Two is just, again, this pacing is not great. I think that had this actually been the second episode, the series wouldn't have done as well because the kind of the best thing about this episode, besides Pudgy Pig, is the backing music of it. Not just the main title, but also there is a musical signature for when the Rangers are talking to Zordon and the risk communicators. There's a special musical note here that happens when they teleport, which is interesting, which I did not notice. And really, until we get actual Pudgy Pig itself, the episode is not great. The setup is pretty good, though. I like the setup. The setup of the episode is there is a food fair that is happening at the juice bar. We get an overhead shot of the juice bar, by the way, which does not look like the building they use for the outside shots are the building inside shots. They don't look like they meet very well, but it is what it is. Um, and so the premise is that, the youth are raising funds for a preschool and a playground. I like the concept of these episodes because in my tabletop game, a lot of the work I do with the Rangers is how they interact in community because I think community is an important aspect of Rangerdom, and in seasons when there's less community involved, like Wild Force, where they're in the community but they're not of the community, you can really see where that falters a bit with them as protectors. So I really do think that this is a great episode for how the Rangers, without being Rangers, interact with their community, and that they're good kids. I do think this interaction with community is a callback to the Sentai version of this episode, which I think the Zyuranger episode for this is a lot stronger, because in that episode, the Yellow Ranger is making a personal connection with an overweight kid whose family all communicate through their love of food, and Pudgy Pig is a response to destroying that love rather than just eating the food. If you've never seen the Zyuranger version of this episode, I think it's better. But there's some kind of connective tissue about community here that works, I think. Pudgy Pig as a villain is also surprisingly effective. Like, if he were later in the season, I think he would have been even more of a threat. He is one of the more iconic villains of the series. It's pretty simple. He's a pig wearing a Roman helmet. Looking at this through the eyes of a 40-year-old, I can really, really, really see where it's a guy in a suit. But I think even though it's not necessarily a wacky villain, that Pudgy Pig is probably one of there's a reason it's one of the most iconic villains of the series. We get a lot of back and forth with Babu, Squat, and Finster. No Goldar in this episode, which is interesting. Um, Finster has a whole basket of monsters. We see him working on one in the opening of the episode when we see Finster that I think is going to be a shark themed monster later in the season. But you can see there's a whole basket. I didn't zoom in on the basket. I didn't linger to see, but there's this idea that Finster is sort of this is where I start making allusions to the bad guys being mirrors of mirrors of the Rangers, essentially, as Rita's generals. So like Finster, you can clearly see has a lot of promise for inventing. So he's sort of an analog for Billy, except he doesn't have any confidence. He's very afraid. Whereas Billy, even though he does have some fear, he does speak up for himself. And Babu and Squat have their own analogs in the Rangers as well. There's an interesting dynamic in that you don't see it as much, I don't think, in Sentai where the generals feel more fully formed, but I think the comics and the Power Rangers itself have really actually helped to sort of flesh out who they are because they made toy lines out of them. So they had to give you a reason to buy the toy line. Um, and I think this kind of playful Babu and Squat friendship, this idea of Finster being afraid of Rita turning him into a toad, the idea that Pudgy Pig isn't good enough, but then he sort of has the hubris of Pudgy Pig is succeeding, so it's my best creation yet. Um, this is where I think Food Fight should be earlier in the season, but it should be a little later. There's some continuity issues with they have their power weapons at this point, which I can't remember in the show. The Power Rangers, if they have to go on a quest like they do in Sentai for them. And I believe firmly in that quest. I don't think you should get power weapons handed to you. It's one of the few things that I disagree with the tabletop game on, honestly. Um, yeah, so I think as the second episode, it doesn't work because the first part of it is super uneven. Um, the opening premise of it I like, but beyond that, the execution of the premise is not good. You could tell here they didn't have a ton of budget because they have the space and it's the juice bar, but the way they decorate it for this, the nods they try to make it seem like teenagers are throwing this food festival. There's no adults here, by the way, besides Ernie, who is apparently a super stud because he is like surrounded by these two beautiful Hawaiian dancers the whole time, and Principal Kaplan. There are no adults at this thing at all. It's very Peanuts Christmas in a way. Also, there's some like really, really early 90s shots here that I can like super see in a couple of years that we'll see in Goosebumps a lot more. But like there's a like a full-on shot where someone is screaming after Pudgy Pig comes in about halfway through the episode. And it's just it's very 90s in a way that is not fun but kind of distracting. Um, it sort of feels like this is an episode made, I don't want to say made for kids because it's not a bad thing. And of course, the show was. It wasn't made for like a retrospective to happen, in 30 years' time. I think if it had been a slightly less dangerous villain, it wouldn't have worked. It works much more in the Sentai because Pudgy Pig is more meaningful. Here, in Power Rangers, Rita is just puzzlingly sick and nauseated by the sight of food, and it's not really rooted in vengeance. It's just Rita sort of being a dick about it. Um, yeah, the Sentai episode is so much better, and the problem too is because I've seen the Sentai episode, I can see where the footage from Sentai was used, and it almost doesn't match up with what they're doing. In some ways, it does because the continuity is fine. But in other ways, if you watch the two side by side, you can compare the literal pullouts, and it's very distracting. Along with that, Kimberly's outfit in this, the kind of weird early 90s cowgirl cutoff shorts with the tied top in pink. eh, It's fine, but it's not your best day, Kim. Um, Principal Kaplan is an interesting side character too because Mr. Kaplan, as they call him, I always call him Principal Kaplan because they acknowledge him as the principal. It's weird they call him Mr. Kaplan. I can tell he's supposed to be sort of a son of Mr. Belding from Saved by the Bell, but he's so much of a buffoon, it's hard to take him seriously. Like they are afraid of him because he has some authority, but he's the only adult that we've met in this universe currently besides, Ernie. And as a counterpoint to Ernie, he seems even more foolish. He gets angry at the This is one of the 3 or 4 episodes where the Rangers unmorphed has Principal Kaplan like get angry at them for a thing that is not their fault. But this is the only episode I think where he actually apologizes for it later. He also likes spicy food. I guess that's redeeming. The thing where, and this is sort of something people remember about this episode, is like he has an ongoing joke about him having a toupee and it falls in a punch bowl. By the way, this fundraising mechanism, I do not understand it. Like, is it $20 for a plate of food? Is it $20 to buy something like a bake sale? Like, they say $20, but they never qualify what the 20 gets you, and it sort of bugs me. Um, I'm also a little bugged by the placement of the banners because they have Zach doing the African American food table, which a little on the nose. Also, Zach, bro, the mac and cheese at that table. One, a little on the nose. Two, looks like the white person from craft services made it. So it's a little, but you can't tell it's the African American table until they pan around the room fully later in the episode. In the episode when they show him working after they separate the group into their little stations, it just looks like the word American is behind him. And then the shots all after that are for the USA table, where Kim and Jason are like hawking burgers and fries and hot dogs, which I have questions about because they get so hyper specific about Hawaiian and Italian food, but like, wouldn't a sausage thing be, Polish or Hungarian? And also, there's a giant tub of baked beans for some reason, because during the food fight started by Bulk and Skull, like, one of them falls into a tub of baked beans that just like are they cold baked beans that are just sitting on the floor? Because that's literally many questions. Nothing is heated, by the way. You don't see any heating elements. You don't see a grill. So I have to assume these burgers and fries are being done somewhere else in the cheese. You don't want to look too close. Again, show made for. It's one of the episodes where you're like, yeah, the show is made for kids. They also put those cocktail umbrellas into slices of watermelon, which is a little strange. I also am not convinced that the sort of linchpin of what defeats Pudgy Pig, which is spicy food, which is the same in both Zyuranger and Power Rangers. I'm not convinced that that hot table, which is there the whole time. I think it might have been constructed when they realized they needed a way to shove the hot food into the episode. It's interesting too because in the game that I run, my alpha is not competent at cooking because I remember this episode in nostalgia is that Alpha 5 is sort of this kind of robot that has been stuck in the command center, so he hasn't gotten out much. So when he tries to cook, he fails. But apparently his sandwiches are really good because he makes like hoagies. He has a chef hat on. He gets distracted. I kind of like Alpha. I like Alpha 5, which is why when we get to Alpha 6, it becomes really hard because Alpha 6 was a redesign of Alpha 5 that I didn't think was as good. Alpha 5 in not every episode where he's a fun companion is helpful, but here I think it's sort of a nice offset. I do think the music they use for Alpha 5 and then also behind Bulk and Skull is it's not as good as the other music, and I sort of have started to notice that already. Um, yeah, so that the unevenness of the premise is not bad, but the execution is not great. Um, I do like Pudgy Pig as a villain. I think Pudgy Pig as a villain is sort of inspired how they do scale ups in the tabletop game, because Pudgy Pig has a lot of powers besides absorbing food. Pudgy Pig also has a teleportation snout thing and can teleport using fire, which is kind of interesting, and you can sort of tell that it's like not really teleporting. It's more like they had a CGI, not a CGI, whatever the low end of CGI is they had it for this episode. And it's an interesting thing to think that Pudgy Pig is actually a pretty strong villain, and were this not being played for a very hyper-specific focus and for a little bit more of a laugh element to it, a little bit more of a fool element to it. Pudgy Pig in the right hands could be an absolutely terrifying, almost Torchwood level villain. There's something kind of Torchwood about a villain that can eat your weapon and then teleport you elsewhere. There's something very Doctor Who about it. In like an R.L. Stein sort of way, you could totally build a half season just around this concept of this absorbing Pudgy Pig characters. I like the idea of, I think this is the first episode where we have, and maybe in places where it's later in the season, it's the second or third time, but there is a ticking clock here. It's not something every Power Ranger episode does, but Zordon gives us a ticking clock of Pudgy Pig. I don't know how he calculates this, but the idea that Pudgy Pig could absorb all the food in the world in 48 hours. I like this ticking clock mechanism. It does make the Rangers' response seem very measured. There are still concerns about escalation, which is something you have to look out for in both this universe and the tabletop game, and a little bit in the comics. I think the 48 hours is an appropriate time scale because if they fail once and then they have to go back after solving the problem. This is a very classic, almost TTRPG style episode. You could literally do a TTRPG episode build around this, which I think would be very satisfying. I like the Rangers here too, in that you can tell they are really gelling well as a team. This is something that I think the comics does well as well, is that there's this idea, and Tommy is going to say later in Zeo about how every Ranger is important. They each bring something to the team. I kind of wish they hadn't split them up into different tables or had given them all tables next to each other. I do think it's kind of weird to split Zach off from the group and to have Billy with Trini kind of split together, doing Asian food. I don't think it's bad. It's a little bit of the thing where the wink, wink, nudge, nudge is that they made the Black Ranger is an African American actor and the Yellow Ranger is an Asian American actress. I believe so. I don't actually know what nationality Third Ring was. I should look that up. I apologize. But this feels like, even though they weren't like trying to dismantle systems, this episode specifically feels like they knew what they were doing in casting a little bit. I'd be curious to see what a version of this episode looks like with the person that was originally the Yellow Ranger who was not Asian, specifically. And I think there was a different actor. I don't know um, if Zach was always being played by this particular actor whose name I'm blanking on. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on names today. Um, yeah, it's interesting too here in the first and the third part of the episodes. We can see the playfulness of the acknowledgement that these Rangers are still teenagers. When they fight back against Bulk and Skull and Bulk and Skull's crew, Bulk and Skull have these two extra people in the group, which are clearly supposed to be analogs for two of the other Rangers, and one of them is just this fabulous, like, four non-blondes kind of person with like the small Dracula style. I really love Bulk and Skull's kind of silent counterpart people because they get no lines, but they're super expressive. Like, someone just had a good casting day. I hope that they'll eventually be at Paramorphicon as like the silent partner, and like they get like disappeared from the city at some point because they're not in every Bulk and Skull portion of the episodes. But I really like them. I like they kind of follow Bulk and Skull around, but you don't lose Bulk and Skull and you don't lose them in this following. It's a little weird that they have these side characters they bring in that they just never bring in again. I know why they didn't do it. They didn't do it for budgetary reasons, but like, give them a line or something, I guess. But I really like them. Uh, I actually I'm not torn on it. So this isn't a critique, but it's an interesting thing where something the Power Rangers did really well is the opening of the show always gives you the premise of the show overall. So it gets you excited for the thing you're going to see. But the relationship between Bulk and Skull and the Rangers is really interesting because they are antagonists, but they're not. It's sort of this reminder of how young these five superheroes are, which I really like. And Bulk and Skull, by the way, this is the first episode where this is the first episode where someone else calls them the Power Rangers that I'm seeing, by the way. I don't know if it happens in anywhere else in the other order, but Ernie literally calls them the Power Rangers here. So at some point between Day of the Dumpster and this episode, wherever it falls in the lineup, the term Power Rangers gets coined in universe. So I'm hoping I'll actually hear that. I'm still waiting for Zach to dance, by the way, to use his hip hop outside of hip hop keto. Um, th- it's an interesting thing in that Bulk and Skull for me are always characters that, and we see this in a couple of episodes, and at least in one place in the Boom comics, that they could have been Rangers except for other choices made. So they are antagonists of our main superhero cast, but they're also sort of anti-heroes. They're actually not afraid of Pudgy Pig. Like, Bulk is not afraid of Pudgy Pig. Like, when they literally bump into Pudgy Pig, and it's weird because Bulk is as tall as Pudgy Pig altogether, which I think is not the correct scale completely. Uh, but Bulk is not afraid, and Skull is not really. They don't run screaming from Pudgy Pig. There is something about them where even though they're sort of like the version of the Rangers where when the Rangers go bad, they sort of turn into Bulk and Skull. I find it interesting. But so this sort of reminds me, the Bulk and Skull Power Ranger relationship dynamic sort of reminds me of like Ghost Rider, um, where it's this idea of a thing going happening world within a world. And there are sometimes antagonists, but you never feel particularly like the protagonist's life is in danger because of these antagonists. And that's what I think about Bulk and Skull. I like that these two characters hang around for even longer than these five Rangers. I think Billy is the only cast member. David Yost is the only cast that has just as long on the show as Bulk and Skull. I think so. I may revise that as we watch it because obviously we've got a ways to go. But Bulk and Skull are around almost longer. They become mentors. I think they're around even longer than Billy's character, which I have many thoughts about when we get to those episodes. Um, yeah, but so Food Fight, I would struggle to see it in my top three, but I would be surprised if it's not in my top 10, at least for a while. Um, the premise is good. The execution is just not as good as Zyuranger, and I can't help but make the comparison just because of how much his footage is there. I like the dynamic between the group that's developed. I like that they use smarts in order to defeat Pudgy Pig because they are robbed of their power weapons, which is one of those very iconic things Power Rangers always have. So they have to use alternative means to actually solve the problem of the day. I like that there is a time clock that they have of when they need to defeat him. I think Pudgy Pig is an appropriately scaled villain. I would have loved to see a version of the episode where they cut out some of the Babu Squat stuff and we get a grown Pudgy Pig versus the Zords. I think the reason this doesn't occur in here is because there's no Zord Pudgy Pig fight in the Zyuranger episode. I'm 99% sure. Because again, in the Zyuranger episode, it's an episode where the Yellow Ranger makes a connection. I believe it's Yellow Ranger, where Bo makes a connection with a kid who's overweight, whose family communicates and loves through food. And what's really cool is that even though this is a show sort of built around hyper health and about like the dare movement, no one here ever feels shamed for weight. If anything, Ernie is sort of celebrated even though he's hefty and it would be really easy to shame him. Like he's sort of celebrated as a side character for being really cool and really eccentric, but really himself. And you can see it with his like ease with the two model babes on his arm. I'm in love with parts of this episode, so it's really hard because that whole first third of it, the pacing is not like the pacing of the setup takes much longer than the setup really needs. It feels a little bit like padded time, so I really don't think Food Fight is the second episode. Um, I think potentially maybe in the original lineup in some cities it was, which is why it's here in the Google episode guide. But I think I like it episode five or six because you're sort of dispensing with the formalities of the Rangers are going to do a thing. It works later. It works later in the first batch of 10 episodes, I think. Like there's a reason Pudgy Pig is one of the most known villains of the series and one of the ones you sort of have to quote unquote have to have. Um, yeah, those are pretty good. I don't think it's going to always be in my top five, but like I have it right now. I have it sort of in the 4 or 5 spot. Because I think I'm gonna find some episodes before the first set of 10 I like more than it. But I think there's a lot of good in this episode I really like. I'm intrigued by the amount of Pudgy Pig powers. I'm like this episode makes me want to know more about Finster than necessarily Rita. Rita's not actually a very strong leader in this episode as a villain. People are afraid of her, and she's been set up as this great villain. But without Goldar around necessarily, and with Babu and Squat kind of taking up a little more air than they need to, this episode makes me want to know more about Finster. He's a really cool designed character. I can't even imagine how the person playing him was in the suit. because the nose is big enough that like it feels like it would have to be puppeted and then dubbed essentially. It feels like it has to do a bit of a dinosaurs type scenario. Yeah, but that is what the episode guide on Google calls episode two. That's Food Fight. Where does Food Fight rank for you? Do you think Food Fight is better than Day of the Dumpster? Do you think Food Fight should be much later? Should it follow meeting Tommy, but before Tommy comes back? Um, what do you think about Food Fight? Let me know, and I'll see you in a couple weeks for our next review. The next review, according to the Google Power Ranger episode order, is High Five, which I think is Trini's Fear of Heights, which I think is probably actually one of the better episodes because it deals with personal fear and overcoming odds. So I think that might rank better higher than Food Fight as its own. But yeah, so this was Food Fight. If you haven't seen the episodes, you can find actually full episodes on YouTube if you just kind of know how to Google it. Um, and I hope you have a good day. And I hope that the power protects you.